Hello and welcome to So Much of Pathos, the show that gleefully hides Hollywood's car keys and giggles relentlessly as it stumbles around looking. I'll be your detective for this evening. So seeing as we've just finished an entire retrospective on Christopher Nolan, I thought now would be interesting to examine some choice examples of a time in superhero movies pre-Christopher Nolan, starting with 2003's Hulk. But first, the case notes. When Marvel Comics filed for bankruptcy in 1996 after the speculator boom burst, which in of itself is a topic too long to be contained here, it was forced to make plans to get out of the hole that it had gotten itself into. The first of which was rebooting its entire comics lineup by hiring new writers for each title and focusing on decreasing the size of the universe to something that was more manageable. This lineup was branded Ultimate Marvel, a parallel universe to Earth 616, which is where most of the main Marvel continuity takes place, and featured the work of well-known writers such as Brian Michael Bendis, Warren Ellis and Mark Millar. However, Ultimate Marvel was launched in the year 2000. The first thing Marvel needed to do was to make back the money to pay off the debt that it had gotten itself into. What they ultimately decided to do was to sell the movie rights to their characters to multiple different studios in the hopes that the box office returns would see them getting out of their hole. Keeping in mind that the 90s had seen all kinds of superhero bombs such as Batman and Robin, The Phantom and Steel, with the exception being Spawn, as it made back twice its budget despite largely negative reviews from critics. Suffice it to say, nobody knew exactly whether or not superhero movies were still going to be popular by the time the project saw release, so selling off their characters to be made into films was seen as a huge gamble for Marvel at the time. Incidentally, if younger viewers have ever wondered why older folks can't stop ranting and raving about how much of a miracle it is for the Avengers to even exist, let alone be any good, this is precisely why. Marvel sold the movie rights to X-Men, Daredevil and the Fantastic Four to 20th Century Fox, Spider-Man got sold to Sony Pictures, Blade went to New Line Cinema, Ghost Rider went to Columbia, The Punisher got sold to Lionsgate, and today's subject, The Incredible Hulk, got sold to Universal. And just to be clear, the studios don't own the characters outright, it just means that they're the only company allowed to make movies out of those characters, and Marvel were guaranteed a percentage of their profits. Luckily for Marvel, the subsequent three releases of Blade, X-Men and Spider-Man became massive successes at the box office, enabling Marvel to officially come out of bankruptcy and open their own company, Marvel Studios, and become active producers in future projects. The production of a movie version of The Incredible Hulk had been floating around since 1990, around the same time that the TV series ended, and various screenwriters over the years had been attached. Around early 2001, respected auteur filmmaker Ang Lee and his producing partner James Schamus became interested in taking on the project, to which they were tasked with putting the Hulk on screen. Having been largely dissatisfied with all previous drafts of the script, the two decided to completely rewrite it whilst borrowing certain elements from the previous drafts, i.e. the father-son dynamic introduced in a draft by Michael France, which in turn was inspired by Brian Banner's first appearance in the comics back in the 80s. Ang Lee stated that he'd also be taking influence from such things as King Kong, Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, Beauty and the Beast, Faust and elements of Greek mythology to envisage his idea of what the Incredible Hulk is. With a budget at around $137 million, the production officially began on March of 2002 to meet its summer release of June 2003, where it received polarising reviews and underperformed by around $5 million at the box office. And we're here to examine exactly what happened, so let's investigate, shall we? Dr. Bruce Banner and Betty Ross, Eric Banner and Jennifer Connelly respectively, are two geneticists working at the Berkeley Biotech Institute researching nanomeds under the supervision of the military and Betty's father, General Thaddeus Ross, played by Sam Elliott. At the same time, Glenn Talbot, a former military officer turned bioscience executive played by Josh Lucas, plans a corporate takeover of the facility on behalf of his company Atheon. Bruce and Betty are to achieve instantaneous cell repair by using low-level gamma radiation exposure to activate the nanomeds once they're introduced into a living organism, which unfortunately results in a few dead frogs. With the origin story by now, you should know the drill. One of the experiments goes totally tits up. Bruce accidentally stands in front of the gamma machine whilst trying to rescue a fellow colleague and gets zapped full of radiation and nanomeds, unleashing dormant memories in his psyche that manifest physically in the form of the Incredible Hulk, a creature born out of Bruce's repressed anger, now unchained. Whilst this is going on, Bruce's long-lost father, David, played by Nick Nolte, tries to reconnect with his son and eventually attempts to recreate the same circumstances that led Bruce to turn into the Hulk, which leads him to getting powers of his own, turning into the Absorbing Man, although there's a bit at the end where he looks a bit like Zax. It's weird. Comic fans have mixed feelings towards this particular movie. There are some who quite like it and some say it completely doesn't work. And one of the most interesting elements of the film is its director, Ang Lee. Ang Lee is a Taiwanese-American filmmaker to whom fans will recognise as the director of the 1995 adaptation of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, as well as Brokeback Mountain. His movies thematically tend to be about tradition versus modernity and Eastern versus Western ideals, but most prominently, his movies are often about hidden emotions, especially in Brokeback Mountain, which told a tale of two queer men trying to find ways to be together whilst they lie to their respective wives about who they really are. So with the stuff about hidden emotions, the idea of Ang Lee making this film isn't that hard of a thought to have, especially seeing as what permeates most of his films is his amazing ability to create beautiful visual poetry from within the frame. So why did Ang Lee of all people decide to make a movie based on the Incredible Hulk specifically? Well, let's have a brief look at his previous film. 2000's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is a period martial arts romantic drama starring Chow Yun-fat, Michelle Yeoh and Zhang Zi. The title itself refers to a place or situation which is occupied by unnoticeable masters, and that's more or less what the story is. A story about the relationship between the teacher-student dynamic, with the central pillar being Zhang Zi's character, Jen Yu, and her relationship with those she encounters. What the movie essentially does is take a somewhat familiar central idea and premise and top-load it with philosophy and beautiful scenery. And it actually physically pains me to use this next word because anyone who uses it always sounds like a complete wanker, but the resulting film truly is poetry. Its choreography is breathtaking, the cinematography is excellent, and the performances are brilliantly nuanced. It's a movie that's keen on working with broad characters and symbols, but it definitely puts everything together in a way that elevates it beyond what would on paper be another fairly decent martial arts movie. Although that having been said, the novel it's adapted from gives the movie a leg up, since its author, Wang Delu, is something of a pioneer in his genre. So there's a clear difference here. The approach that Ang Lee took with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon clearly worked for that film, but doesn't when applied to the Hulk. But it's not as if the Hulk is entirely ill-suited to such an interpretation given the origins of the character. Stan Lee has said that the Hulk story began as a combination of Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein. The Cold War was in full swing in 1962, and both sides, as well as building huge conventional military forces, were also pushing the boundaries of their respective atomic doomsday weapons, testing bigger and more advanced bombs throughout the 50s. Nuclear paranoia was a part of the American psyche, including the idea that mutation could create deformed monstrosities. The nuclear mutant, then, is a sort of modern Prometheus for the 20th century, a monster inadvertently created not by medicine, but by nuclear science and short-sighted militarism. The Edward Hyde aspect of the Hulk character adds a less political and more psychological dimension to the story. Hyde, in Robert Louis Stevenson's book, is the embodiment of Dr. Jekyll's inner demons, the part of himself he had tried to repress made flesh through an exotic potion. Likewise, the Hulk is the raging pain of Bruce Banner felt as a child and repressed as an adult, now given form, not through chemistry, but atomic fire. A Hulk film, then, has in theory the potential to explore themes of war, mental trauma, scientific progress, and the dark depths of the human soul. In theory. It can equally be a noisy, smashy blockbuster, but there's no reason that an introspective, arty Hulk film fails as a concept. But unfortunately, in practice, Ang Lee's approach to the Hulk falls short due to a bad script. The biggest setbacks to the Hulk are that the pacing is disjointed and half the dialogue is seriously off. A lot of Hulk is spent watching characters talk out loud about their backstory, punctuated by the occasional action scene where Bruce hulks out and fights a handful of dudes before bouncing off to do something else, and all of said sequences run out of steam way before they should, resulting in a film that never fully gets across the idea that the Hulk is meant to be a manifestation of Bruce's anger, because we never ever get the sense that the Hulk is that angry. On top of that, I've seen a lot of superhero movies, particularly recently, that are ashamed of their own pulpy roots, and there are moments in Hulk that completely take the piss. In fact, this is one of the problems with the origin. Rather than the Hulk being born out of Bruce's repressed feelings that get ignited by gamma radiation, we've now got this stupidly elaborate thing where Bruce's father was experimenting with DNA splicing, or something, it's rather unclear, back in the 1960s, and then used himself for human trials, which then got passed on to Bruce when he was born. Then cut to several years later where Bruce is exposed to the gamma radiation as well as breathing in the nanomeds he and Betty were experimenting on, and that's what creates the Hulk. I hate this primarily because it's an idiotically complicated way of explaining away a very, very simple part of the Hulk as a character. Similar was the issue with the Amazing Spider-Man and Peter Parker building his own web shooters, which, whilst I acknowledge was a staple of the original comics, is way more difficult to buy than what Sam Raimi's movies did, which was basically to make it easier for themselves by saying that the radioactive spider bite means Peter Parker can shoot webs as well as stick to walls. Because ultimately, if you're dealing with science this soft, you better keep your bloody story straight. Beyond that, there are really irritating problems when it comes to the pace, mostly because it has an overlong and draggy second act. I can only imagine what went down during production, but on screen there appears to be a clear internal debate as to what this movie actually is. Ang Lee certainly has his way by including a lot of pretty nature cinematography as to imply that the Hulk is some kind of elemental force as well as something that would easily make its peace amongst the wild in a very contemplative way, but all that really does is make its attempts to also be a big studio action movie all the more jarring. As an example of the muddiness of the writing, here's a hypothetical scenario. You're a screenwriter and the main villain's going to send his attack dogs to kill the love interest character. You need your hero to get there as quickly as possible and deal with that problem. You can't just send him there because he'd get killed really easily, so how do you get yourself out of the corner you've painted yourself into? Well, what you end up doing is contriving a reason for Banner to turn into the Hulk, which is why this happens.
Outside, asshole, I want to talk to you.
Consider, Talbot actually has no reason to be angry at this point. Banner hasn't gone over his head to Ross at all. Like, nothing like it. He's actually been identified as a security risk and locked out of his own operation, putting Talbot in a position to steal his research with the General's blessing. Talbot should be cracking open the champagne and sending Banner gloating emails right now. But instead, he's angry for reasons that make absolutely no sense, which jarringly departs from how Talbot has been characterised up to this point as a smug corporate suit and not a fisty maniac. The net result of this is one of the several parts in the film that gives the impression of being written on the back of a napkin. Although, to be fair, this does lead to my favourite line in the movie.
Talbot, yeah? You're making me angry.
Alright, wooden dialogue is wooden, but sod you, I liked it. Anyway, Banner flips out and turns into the Hulk, beats these guys up, and then hops over to Betty's house to protect her from a pack of Hulk dogs. At which point you realise the only reason why this scene is happening is because the audience is probably dying of scurvy at this point, and we need to inject some incitement into the mix, which basically means we've contrived ourselves out of a hole with Banner turning into the Hulk, and then contrived ourselves into an action scene. And of course, nothing better illustrates the problem that this film has setting a tone than the simple fact that this arty exploration of emotional baggage and childhood trauma happens in the same film as Hulk dogs. Individually, these are, as I've said, both valid approaches to the Hulk character and his world. One can imagine on the one hand Chris Nolan taking the childhood trauma arty approach had he been in charge, whilst on the other hand someone could have made a wacky light-hearted blockbuster for kids featuring Hulk dogs created by a mad scientist and also made it work. But you simply cannot have both these approaches in one film. It would be like if the Jim Carrey version of the Riddler had shown up as a villain in The Dark Knight. It just becomes profoundly confusing for the audience as you can't work out the rules of the universe the characters inhabit. And the annoying thing is that I admire enormously what Ang Lee is trying to do and the tone and aesthetic he's trying to take. There's all this stuff that Ang Lee is trying, but it never quite fits together into a cohesive whole. See, the thing about Ang Lee is that in the latter period of his career, he tends to make the kind of stuff that aligns both the film press and average Joe audiences in creating stuff that have artistic weight as well as enough spectacle to fill a mainstream theatrical release. See also the previously mentioned Crouching Tiger, as well as his more recent efforts in Life of Pi. Unfortunately, Hulk, in attempting the same feat, marks one of Ang Lee's more significant failings. With that said, there is at least a genuine sense of someone trying to make this interesting. As an example, a prominent visual idea in Ang Lee's movies is windows and doors, or more specifically, interior framing. The idea of windows within windows to imply distance, which in of itself is a direct lift from Yasuhiro Ozu. Bruce's troublesome past is signified by the usage of a closed door. In one particular dream sequence, it shows the Hulk standing inside it, symbolising his subconscious, and when Bruce and Betty open that same door later on in the film, the room is shown to be empty. The same goes for mirrors. The first time we meet adult Bruce Banner is when we see him shaving in front of a mirror, and this scene is then repeated later on with the Hulk staring back. I imagine this was in part the inspiration for the infamous comic panelling stuff that occurs during key sequences. Look, I'm not going to defend it exactly, but as an attempt to transfer an element of comic book visual aesthetic to cinema, it's a noble failure, but still a failure. Bear in mind though, Ang Lee is not the only filmmaker to have attempted this. Both Sin City movies directly transferred the style and colour scheme of Frank Miller's original comics onto the big screen, and it worked brilliantly, creating a kind of hyper-exaggerated parody of noir film visuals which chimed perfectly with the personality of the piece. Sticking with Miller adaptations, we could also point to 300. There's a reason why that film leans so heavily on the slow motion button that if these scenes were sped up, the movie works out about 20% shorter. One of the strengths of panel-based illustration is that since you're telling a story with a combination of consecutive and simultaneous images, you can pick out specific moments, snapshots in time for dramatic effect. A whip raised in anger, an elephant cast from a cliff. 300's dramatic time freezing is an attempt to create these moments in an inherently fast-changing medium. Some like it, some hate it. I'd say it works within reason. So yeah, the comic panel gimmick Ang Lee tries here is ugly, distracting, and never seems to successfully enhance any scene in which it's employed. But trying to import some of the look of comics is not an inherently poor idea. He just picked the wholly wrong way to do it. Like, it doesn't work at all, but you can't fault someone for at least trying to make things interesting. And there are plenty of examples of Ang Lee trying to make this interesting, like how curiously, the first time we see Bruce Banner transform, Ang Lee decides to play this scene not for the visceral joy of seeing the title character for the first time, but more so as an emotional plot beat.
Betty!
Although, admittedly, every time Bruce hulks out, it just looks like he's trying to negotiate his way through a particularly tricky shit. Oh yeah, and there's also meant to be some sly jabs at the War on Terror in there as well, in as much as the more firepower that gets thrown at the threat, the bigger and angrier the threat becomes, or something. Essentially what Ang Lee means by all this is to try and create a sense of distance. Bruce has a very distant relationship with his own sense of self, with his parents, or specifically his father, and with his own complicated feelings. The annoying thing is that whilst there's a lot of stuff in here that clearly doesn't work, there's a good 3-minute section in here where it's just the Hulk leaping around the desert to himself exploring the nature, and it's totally clear that this is what Ang Lee wanted his Hulk movie to be a lot more like. The idea of a complicated ball of emotions being away from the world, trying to figure himself out. I mean, it's definitely not the Hulk from the comics, but it's interesting. Although what kind of ruins it is that this version of the Hulk rendered in CGI does look like a piece of animation rather than a relatively believable monster on screen. Keep in mind, of course, that this was 2003 and motion capture was a really new thing. Besides, this was the first truly modern attempt to portray the Hulk properly on screen rather than putting paint on a bodybuilder. Yeah, the Mark Ruffalo Hulk looks better, a lot better. But we have the advantage of 12 years of hindsight and technological progress. As much as anything, Hulk, and the Incredible Hulk after it, played a role in showing later designers and animators what not to do, allowing the Avengers to finally get it about right. For example, you notice that this Hulk is the biggest of any of the films. He's about the size of King Kong, which presumably reflects that that was one of Ang Lee's inspirations in designing this interpretation of the character, but it makes him look out of place in the film's world, less real. Combine that with the weightlessness that goes hand in hand with older CGI and he ends up looking like a carnival float. They've also failed to design the face in such a way that it actually looks like Eric Bana. The Ruffalo Hulk actually seems like it could be the same character as the Ruffalo Bruce Banner. The audience of Ang Lee's film probably would have followed the emotional thread of Hulk non-Hulk better if Hulk actually seems more to be a side of Eric Bana, whom we've already spent a lot of time with by the point the Hulk starts smashing, rather than, well, Mark Labette. And finally, well, he's just way too green, isn't he? I mean, the Hulk is green-skinned, but Bruce is pink-skinned. He doesn't glow pink. It's mid-2003, Two Towers is out, and the animators have all these new special effects to try and make him look real. Wet skin, dirt and sand textures, but it's all for naught if he's this bright. By the Avengers, Hulk is still green, but just not in a neon way. He isn't just coloured in. He's a green that looks like it could reflect the hues of muscle and veins showing through skin and hair. He's a green with texture and subtlety. Ultimately, though, a special effect is only as good as the performance underneath it that supports it, even though it actually was Ang Lee that did the motion capture. So we're meant to believe that this bright green thing is also meant to be Eric Bana when in regular form. Eric Bana is a great actor and has been excellent in many other things, but this time his casting as Bruce Banner does feel somewhat misplaced. He's never quite able to gauge with the introverted nerdiness of the character and instead feels more suited for your standard action lead, which, if that's what they were going for, would certainly be interesting if it wasn't a fundamental misunderstanding of the character. It's made mention that he's supposedly closed off emotionally and that having him work closely with Betty is going to bring tension, seeing as they went for a breakup a few years prior, which is probably the realistic approach towards someone as frail as Bruce is, but all that seems to translate to is a kind of bland stoicism that neither engages nor leaves us wanting to know more. In fact, Banner's performance makes for a great synecdoche for the whole movie. It's somewhat dull and humorless and doesn't understand, or failing that abjectly rejects, its own self. As well as being surprisingly slow-paced, which in of itself might be the deal-breaker for a lot of people, what clinches it is that everything is so dour and downbeat all the time. This came out 2 years before the Christopher Nolan Batman movies began, but even they were funny in a straining on the toilet and accidentally pooing your pants kind of way.
Miss Kyle. So that's what that feels like.
Whilst I said I was in favour of a more thoughtful and introspective superhero movie, it doesn't really work here because it's to the detriment of the rest of the film. The majorest of the major themes in Hulk is the relationship between a father and his son, a revisiting of themes Ang Lee has already explored in prior movies, particularly his Father Knows Best thematic trilogy that he made at the very beginning of his career. The problem here is that even though Hulk vs. Absorbing Man is the final fight and is Bruce's final conflict as a character, the final fight doesn't have any sense of stakes because their conflict barely gets any time elsewhere in the movie. This is the main plotline concerning the main villain and is the main source of tension for Banner's story arc, which concerns him trying to figure out his own past, and it's treated with a surprising amount of derision from the movie itself. The final fight at the end is meant to be the big emotional climax as well as the big final action beat, and it feels totally weightless because the structure has done a shockingly poor job of building up to it. Honestly, given the screenplay, you'd think the final boss fight would be against Sam Elliott or Josh Lucas, even though the latter gets eliminated in a monumentally shit way despite the loudness of his presence in the script. And given the overall weightlessness of the CGI as well as the need to include more action, possibly at the insistence of the studio, this supposedly thoughtful and introspective psychodrama at the end basically just turns into two surprisingly badly rendered monsters pummeling each other. This is a problem that's consistent throughout the whole movie. When Bruce turns into the Hulk, I don't care, and by the end when Nick Nolte turns into anti-Hulk, I don't care times two. And whilst their fight ends with this gorgeous underwater image of the Hulk unleashing all of his power that ends up overwhelming his father in a bid to symbolise Bruce returning all of the anger his father's past actions had inadvertently caused him, it barely means anything because it's barely been discussed elsewhere. Given the way the narrative is laid out, it unintentionally feels like General Ross and Talbot are the main villains in the middle of Bruce's search for the self, and that his father is just a footnote. This is by far the biggest drop ball in the film. Ang Lee's best foot forward is to present the story of the Hulk as a psychodrama told through the prism of his difficult relationship with his father, and yet the movie spends so little time developing it, besides having long exposition dumps in the form of flashbacks provided to Betty thanks to David, that by the time we get to paying off this subplot, which should actually be the main plot with a big emotional climax, it feels like utterly wasted breath. Oh yeah, and then there's the ending where Bruce is hiding out in South America and a frog crawls across his hat in the final shot. It's potentially just a bit of pretentious symbolism, but if you'll indulge me, here's what I think Ang Lee is going for. So, at the beginning of the movie, they're experimenting on frogs which keep accidentally blowing up. Then Bruce is exposed to the same gamma radiation and Betty gets worried that Bruce is going to blow up in the same way. Of course, he does metaphorically blow up whenever he turns into the Hulk, but at the end he does somewhat literally blow up during his final conflict with his father when he overwhelms his father with all the power of his rage. And at the end, now that Bruce is alone once more and on the run, the frog on his hat suggests that Bruce is now in control of his anger and can go on to live a relatively peaceful life, even though years later the Incredible Hulk, which is official canon with the MCU, would later go on to retcon this interpretation of the ending along with everything else. And that's quite sad, because along with the stuff with the Hulk on his own in the wilderness, it's just another small glimpse at the fairly decent and thoughtful Hulk movie this film could have been. But at the end of the day, if it's true that a politician can talk for hours and not say anything, then Ang Lee's Hulk could probably run for government and be president of the multiverse before you've even had breakfast. Ang Lee's Hulk has severe pacing and tone problems, largely due to a muddy screenplay that barely has a cohesive central story. To an extent, it feels almost like they had ideas for 2 different movies and then had to smash them together in a hurry, as we spend most of the story with Bruce trying to figure himself out whilst being up against General Ross and the military who are trying to blow him up, which eventually climaxes with a finale from an entirely different plot. There's the suggestion that the Hulk as a character can't sustain his own movie because Bruce Banner is too reluctant a character in the narrative to be entertaining, which is probably why he's often consigned to the role of the Heavy in the Avengers. But there's a part of me that reckons this really can work, given how close this movie comes at points to being really interesting. The movie could have been another Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon for Ang Lee. It could have satisfied both critics and audiences alike if it went for it being so badly paced, so thematically muddy, and so joyless. Writing rave reviews for this show is easy, and writing bad reviews is even easier, but notably imperfect is a whole other thing, and unfortunately that's what Ang Lee's Hulk is. But my opinion probably doesn't matter, as this movie's legacy speaks for itself. Universal Pictures were quite unhappy with the end product, as well as the box office returns and the critical reception it received, so they decided to sell the movie rights for The Incredible Hulk back to Marvel, eventually leading to Marvel Studios trying this for themselves in 2008, with Ed Norton in the lead role and Louis Leterrier as director, effectively retconning this movie out of the MCU canon, although producer Avi Arad often refers to this movie as a parallel universe one-shot. Ang Lee's Hulk is an interesting experiment in superhero storytelling, severely undercut by the weight of its own ambition. It's not terrible and it's not entirely messy, but if it were a cake, I wouldn't trust it to transfer cleanly onto a serving platter. And on that note, I call it case closed. I'm Matt Crowley, and that was Hulk.